One of my primary encouragements to people when we think about personal development in evangelism, or when it comes to maybe equipping a congregation in this area, is that before we jump to strategies and methods and competencies and tactics, are we a people who are continually encountering the presence of Jesus in ways that his goodness, his richness, his transforming power, his grace is so profoundly evident to us and so good to us that we just want to tell other people about him? I'm sure part of this is my personality, but one thing that I do seem to observe among many different kinds of people is that when you really enjoy something, when you're really excited about something, it's very natural to want to share whatever that might be. Whether it's a vacation or a meal or a movie, whatever it might be, you talk to people about it. And I think that evangelism in many ways is meant to come out of a similar place.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Well, welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation. I'm really glad that you have decided to join us, whether you are on a commute, whether you're at the gym, whether you're listening to us while you're working, however you are listening to this podcast. I'm so glad that you have decided to join us for another conversation as we continue this journey of becoming sowers in the places where we live, work, learn, and play. As always, if you're not following us on any of our social media platforms, or following or subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or even on YouTube, you can hit subscribe and watch these interviews via video format. I want to invite you to go ahead and do that. You can find the links in the show notes. Well, today I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Lucas Burton. Lucas is a follower of Jesus with a passion for helping people discover their true identity and purpose. After earning his M.Div from McMaster Divinity College in 2017, he served in campus ministry, cross-cultural missions, and then pastoral leadership. Now, as the National Evangelism Lead for Message Canada, he equips churches to share the gospel in a post-Christian world. Lucas is also pursuing a PhD in Intercultural Studies, focusing on evangelism in today's culture. He and his wife Rachel live in Toronto with their 5-pound Pomeranian named Hope. In this episode, Lucas Burton shares his journey into evangelism shaped by mentorship, theological reflection, and hands-on experience. He emphasizes the power of genuine spiritual conversations and the warmth of human connection in sharing the gospel. Lucas and I discuss the mission of Message Canada, the evolving spiritual climate in the country, and innovative approaches to reaching the younger generation. I think you're going to be blessed by this conversation. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Lucas Burton. Well, Lucas, official welcome to the Sowers Podcast. It is great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Matt. Glad to be here.
Lucas, I'd love for you to jump right in. I think from the very first time I met you, I could already sense that within you is this passion for sharing the good news of Jesus. So can you share a bit from your own personal journey into evangelism and passion for sowing the gospel?
Yeah, absolutely. I was blessed, I guess, privileged to grow up in a Christian home, and in particular, I think a context where the idea of being a follower of Jesus connecting to evangelism, even though that maybe wasn't the word I would have, especially as a kid, associated it with, was kind of just normative. So my parents, and especially my mom, I think were really intentional about shaping both my and my sister's kind of view of what it meant to follow Jesus in terms of sharing him with other people, whether in word or in deed. And so a lot of my early memories, including some that maybe I look back on with humor, involve me doing that in whatever kind of stumbling way I might have tried to do so as a kid. My mom tells a story of getting a call when I was, I think, in kindergarten, requesting her to come to the principal's office. And when she got there, the story was that I had told one of my friends that if he didn't trust in Jesus and accept him into his heart, he was going to go to hell. So we have since grown in our ability to nuance some of those conversations and topics a little bit and know how to appropriately enter into them. But yeah, I just think from a young age, I kind of was convicted that people needed to know Jesus, and I was excited to share him with them. That sort of continued for me throughout school, high school, that kind of thing. And then I think a major sort of like catalyst in this process for me was when I got to university and got connected with a student ministry. Today it's called Power to Change. At the time it was Campus for Christ. And this was one of the first times in my life that someone had kind of come alongside me in my own Christian discipleship process and intentionally challenged, but also encouraged and equipped me in the area of evangelism. So I remember being in a discipleship group for the first time, and my leader at the time, his name is Jordy. He said, "Hey, would anybody be up to going to the cafeteria later this week and just chatting with people and seeing if we could get into some conversations about Jesus?" And I was really just like surprised that that was something that people were even willing to do. But I'm like, yeah, I would totally like to do something like that. You know, for the next 2 or 3 months, once or twice a week, I would just follow Jordy around the cafeteria. And, you know, for the first several weeks, I would just sit there and listen and observe the way he would interact with the people and how he would go from, you know, kind of just an open conversation about a general topic, getting to know a person, and then slowly transitioning into maybe a more spiritually focused conversation and looking for an opportunity to present the gospel. And the more I did that, the more I sort of became an active participant in the conversation and not just someone sitting there and listening. And I eventually got to the point where, you know, I would be the person kind of leading a conversation like that. At the same time that this was happening in my local church context as well, they had begun offering a class on evangelism as well. And so I was taking that class, and part of that involved going out on like the weekends to local parks or down by the lake. I was living in Oakville at the time, and looking to strike up conversations with people that were just on the street. Sometimes it was more formal, like street preaching. Other times it was just walking up to people on park benches and seeing if we could have an opportunity to chat with people, to pray with them, and to share Christ. Those kind of years, I mean, I'm somewhere between the age of like 17 and maybe 20, 21 at the time, were kind of like a catalyst for me, I think, specifically in the area of evangelism. And initially that started off with kind of like a local sort of Canadian focus, but my involvement with Power to Change also began to open up a lot of opportunities for me to travel outside of that context and participate in, you know, short-term missions trips. For the better part of like 3 or 4 years, I found myself pretty well every February and every summer, I was either in Western or Eastern Europe, at one point South Asia, and another point West Africa, mostly in the context of trips that had a pretty intentional focus on evangelism, including verbal proclamation of the gospel. And so a lot of those experiences began to raise, I think, just initially my awareness, but then later like questions theologically and practically about what gospel contextualization looks like, what evangelism looks like in a context different than the one that I knew or had grown up with, and how evangelism is, like specifically the verbal proclamation of the gospel, how it fits within the broader witness of the church and the church's broader mission in the world. When I finished university, I went to seminary, went to McMaster Divinity College, and that was an interesting part of my journey because on the one hand, I found myself in like a Christian bubble for about 3 years because I'm in a Christian, you know, educational environment. I'm living at home. My family is Christian. I was interning at my church at the time. And so it was like a rarity that I would even like brush up against a non-Christian, maybe on the bus. That was about it. And it was killing me because I came out of a university context where there was non-Christians everywhere, my friends, peers, and it was like not at all hard to find someone that you could try to share Christ with. And that area was kind of like starving for me when I was in seminary. But at the same time, those years really gave me an opportunity to, I think, develop both like a competency when it comes to theological reflection, but also just a richer and more robust biblical theology. And specifically, they kind of brought me to examine fundamental questions like what is the gospel in sort of a new and fresh way. And I think the effect of that was deepening not only my sort of theological awareness of the gospel's scope and its application to life, but by extension, just my conviction that like the gospel really is good news and that it does have the power to transform the lives of people. And so I came out of seminary not knowing exactly where the Lord was leading me with respect to ministry, but an opportunity came up for me to join staff with Power to Change and specifically help launch their student ministry in Copenhagen. And so that was kind of like the opposite of being in a Christian bubble. So I jumped on a plane with a couple of friends. We moved to Copenhagen and we spent the year trying to help launch a movement of evangelism and discipleship among students. And so again, being in that context was sort of a melting pot of like the theological reflection, that I had just spent, better part of 3 years sitting in, with more real-time evangelistic practice in a Western, very post-Christian kind of cultural context. When I came home from that, I continued working with the student ministry in some kind of research and development roles, and then spent about 3.5 years pastoring just until the end of 2023. And since that time, I've transitioned out of my pastoral ministry and have recently joined staff with Message Canada, which is an evangelistic organization on Canadian soil. And right now I'm serving as the National Evangelism Lead for the ministry.
Lucas, just hearing the experiences, both developmental and experiential, but the experiential was likely developmental as well. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could reflect specifically, now that you've kind of communicated that history for us over the last several minutes, what do you believe were the key training pieces? Like, I think about someone that's listening to this podcast as an example. They're saying, how do I become an evangelist? And they're hearing your story of being raised in a Christian home with a sense of evangelism from the very get-go, going off to school and being mentored and discipled and trained in such a way, like, let's go to the cafeteria and have some conversations, spending some times in Western Europe, going back to Copenhagen, getting a seminary degree. As you think about all of those training experiences, what are some of, do you believe, the keys for evangelism development?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I think there's kind of maybe two dimensions to how I would approach answering that one. The first is something that I hope is just really accessible to all of us all the time. And I think I would just describe it in terms of an ongoing encounter with Christ. Probably my favorite passage to point people to when I think about sort of like the starting foundation for evangelism is in Acts chapter 4, where Peter and John, they have just healed a man who had been lame since birth on their way to the temple. It creates quite a kerfuffle. They end up preaching the gospel to a crowd of people. They're arrested by the religious leaders, and then they're being interrogated. And in the course of that interrogation, they're charged not to speak or to teach in the name of Jesus. Just close down the shop, no more evangelism. And I love the way that Peter and John respond to the religious leaders. Initially, it sounds almost defiant, but I actually think it's just a simple and honest reflection. And they basically say, whether it's right for you, whether it's right, in your sight to listen to you rather than to God, we'll let you decide that. But as for us, we cannot but speak of the things that we have seen and heard. And so that, to me, that like understanding that the boldness, the conviction, the desire to make Christ known for Peter and John, it came not primarily out of obedience to a particular commissioning that Jesus had given them, though of course that is playing a role there. But when I hear them say that, it seems to suggest to me that really the motivating, driving force is that they have seen and heard the living and the risen Christ. And it's out of the overflow of their own encounter with him, what they have seen and heard, that they cannot help but share him with other people. And so I think one of my primary encouragements to people when we think about personal development in evangelism, or when it comes to maybe equipping a congregation in this area, is that before we jump to strategies and methods and competencies and tactics, are we a people who are continually encountering the presence of Jesus in ways that his goodness, his richness, his transforming power, his grace is so profoundly evident to us and so good to us that we just want to tell other people about him. I'm sure part of this is my personality, but one thing that I do seem to observe among many different kinds of people is that when you really enjoy something, when you're really excited about something, it's very natural to want to share whatever that might be, whether it's a vacation or a meal or a movie, whatever it might be. You talk to people about it. And I think that evangelism in many ways is meant to come out of a similar place. So that would maybe be the first kind of track. I guess the other then is to say, like, what does it look like to practically be equipped, trained or otherwise resourced in evangelism? And I think for folks who are maybe a part of church communities already that are thinking about this, my encouragement would be to make that desire known to your leaders. And hopefully there's already a conversation taking place, but in the absence of that, maybe that would begin a conversation about what it looks like to see the congregation practically equipped to communicate the gospel in our cultural moment. I think we're still kind of living in the golden age of Christian publishing. And so there's a myriad of books and resources on the topic that are specifically reflecting on evangelism, not just generically, but like in this particular cultural moment that we're living in right now. What does faithful witness look like? And so I would commend people to resources like that. But I do believe that a big part of this starts with consciously and intentionally saturating ourselves in the goodness of Jesus and in the transforming power of the gospel, and having a conviction that it really is good news for the people around us.
Share with us maybe a few experiences of having spiritual conversation that led to much more intense gospel conversation. I think as I've engaged on campuses, and specifically with what I would call disruptive evangelism, so probably not so dissimilar from your experience with Power to Change students. Before I got involved in doing those experiences, I think I would say, oh my goodness, everyone's going to be this hardened atheist who, regularly listens to Sam Harris and has a very developed worldview as far as why they do not believe that God exists, just to begin naming a few things, right?
Yes.
But in actuality, there is a warmness and a friendliness to conversation that I did not anticipate. So speak to some of your own experiences and some of the maybe myths that were debunked in that process.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Matt. I appreciate that. I think that perception of what we should expect when we try to share our faith is probably one that a lot of people share, and hopefully one that, gets debunked in the process as they take steps to move towards people intentionally and to open up conversation. I do think a lot of that comes down to the way that we approach those conversations, though. Maybe it's like a positive feedback loop at times too, where if we anticipate, an argument or a debate or something intense, and we prepare for that outcome and kind of meet that energy, it can kind of create that in some sense. But I would agree with you. I think my overall experience, in many ways, no matter where I've traveled or what context I've approached evangelism in, is that when we approach people with a humble sincerity and a genuine interest in them and in their lives, with a genuine desire to understand where they're coming from, what their perspective is, a curiosity about the way that they see the world, about their felt needs, their fears, their desires. I'm of the opinion that there's far more that unites me with any other human being that I might encounter than there is that separates us. And so you could imagine the person that's like the polar opposite, spectrum to someone such as myself. And I still think that notwithstanding all those differences, we have a lot in common simply by virtue of being human. And so I think to appeal to some of those foundational realities of what it means to be human opens doors. And that's been my experience. I don't know if you want me to share any particular stories, but I'm happy to do so if that's helpful.
Yeah, well, please do. Share one story of maybe a memorable experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I guess one that's memorable because it was just recently. I was in Vancouver last week, and on my flight there was sitting in the window seat. And so there's two gents to my left. And our flight is heavily disrupted several times. So we're sitting on the tarmac at Toronto Pearson Airport for like 4 hours before we actually take off. So for better or for worse, that's a captive audience if you're an evangelist. Funny enough, though, I was more or less keeping to myself and was just working on some stuff. But when we got in the air, the typical conversation on an airplane is normally like, oh, is this your final destination? Or what are you traveling for? That kind of thing. The young guy that was sitting next to me, he's about 29 years old. He asked me, so what do you do? And are you traveling to Vancouver for business? I'm still working out like how exactly to describe that succinctly to people, without like raising certain immediate impressions. So I just said, well, I'm a Christian minister and I work for an organization that serves churches in Canada. And so, yeah, I'm heading to Vancouver because the ministry headquarters are there. And to my surprise, this young guy said, wow, I've never met a Christian minister before. And he said, like, you look really young to be a Christian minister. So he wanted to know how old I was. And he thought I looked a lot younger than I am, which I guess is a compliment. But he was really curious to learn more about what got me into Christian ministry. And so we initially just started talking about our respective vocations and things like that. And I just said to him, hey, I would really love to hear your perspective. He identified that he's not a Christian himself. And I said, can you tell me what your perception of Christianity is? I would just love to hear, like, when you think about the faith, what comes to mind? And so he shared a really interesting reflection. I guess his background is in a mix of mechanical engineering and sociology, quite a spectrum. Wow. And so he kind of shared like a high level perspective on the ways that he believes that the Judeo-Christian worldview has shaped Western culture. And much to my surprise, this isn't often the common narrative in our day.
Yeah.
He had a very positive view of Christianity's effect on Western culture. He himself is not like ethnically from the Western world. He would be from a more Eastern context. And so even having that perspective, he was sort of speaking to it in that respect. And so we chatted a little bit about that, and it was kind of more of an abstract, high level conversation. And then I said to him, "This is so interesting. Can I ask you another question? Can you tell me about your perception of Jesus in particular?" And so we chatted a little bit more about Jesus, and he was very respectful, interested in Jesus as a teacher, open to the idea that he might be some kind of God. But the kind of the hinge in our conversation was, he said, I think where I struggle with thinking about Jesus as God or God in general is the concept of God just seems so difficult to imagine being able to comprehend. He said, like, if you had an ant farm, on your table at home, your desk at home, for all intents and purposes, you are the God of those ants. And he's like, how could they ever be able to comprehend you or even wrap their brain or like who you are? And I said, you're making a great point. Can I make a suggestion? And he goes, okay. I said, can you imagine if in that scenario, I'm the God of these ants in this ant farm? And it's like impossible for them to really be able to understand who I am or comprehend me. Can you imagine if there was a way for me to become an ant and enter into the ant farm and then like reveal myself to these other ants in the context of having assumed their being, their ant being? And he's like, yeah, okay. I said, so, at the center of the Christian faith is this audacious claim that the eternal God, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, has become a human being. And he's done so for precisely the reason that you're describing, so that he might fully reveal himself to us in ways that our humanity can understand. And he was really, really just like captured by that idea. And so we spent time talking about the uniqueness of Christ. He, in the end, took a Gospel of John and was really interested in hearing more. And I'm hoping we'll have a chance to catch up, actually. He lives relatively local to me, so we'll see where that goes.
How did you feel after that conversation ended?
Oh man, I was so encouraged. To be honest with you, I was still just reeling from the unexpected perspective that I heard him articulate. Like, maybe it's an unfair story to share on a podcast like this, to be honest with you, because I don't want to make it sound like every opportunity I have to share Christ is like someone who's just kind of, I felt like someone was sort of pitching underhand to me the whole time, almost setting me up for perfect gospel on-ramps in some sense. But I think I felt reminded that there are people who really are interested in conversation, who do have a curiosity, who are open to reflecting. And, it reminds me of Jesus saying that the harvest is plentiful. And I believe that that's true in our day. I think sometimes we can be caught up and maybe even inhibited by a narrative that focuses on how much culture has changed and the way that Christianity has moved from, and certainly the church has moved from sort of a center place in our culture to the margins, which is certainly true. And we need to understand the implications of that. But I think we can overinterpret that narrative to assume that therefore people don't want to hear about Jesus or faith or things like that. And I should mention as well, in the course of that conversation, where I was probably most encouraged is we moved from kind of this philosophical conversation about Christianity to something specific about Jesus. And then I didn't share this part, but by the end of the conversation, we were now talking specifically about how has Jesus impacted my life, and specifically in areas where there might be insecurities or fears or issues of identity. How has following Jesus actually transformed something personal for me? And so I think just being able to walk through even that progression with someone just left me feeling so encouraged.
Friends, we'll get back to my conversation with Lucas Burton in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Message Canada and their event, Advance Summit. If you're an evangelist, a church leader, or a Christian who wants to share Jesus, Message Canada invites you to take part in their annual Advance Summit this February 25 to 27 in Calgary. Join a group of like-minded believers from across Canada who want to fan the flames of evangelism in our lives and in our churches. Their gathering will be marked by dynamic teaching from leaders, practitioners, and scholars, practical breakout sessions designed to help you implement your learning and rich times of prayer, worship, and mutual sharpening. As they draw near to God together, they're believing that He will draw near to them so that they can be encouraged, equipped, and empowered to advance the gospel in Canada. To learn more and to purchase tickets, please visit advancesummit.org. Once again, that is advancesummit.org. And now back to my conversation with Lucas. Well, I think it touches to a very real and important fact when it comes to these conversations, which is that we are entering in at a place that God is already doing something.
Yes.
Right? It's not like the highway begins with us. The highway of this person's life has been going, and we just simply happen to come, on the on-ramp, and then we have the exit ramp, but we trust that God is still moving and working in that person's life. So God, in that sense, was preparing you for the conversation, preparing this individual for the conversation, and it's see fit that you would sit beside him on this journey to Vancouver. And so therefore I trust that it was simply your faithfulness in that conversation, and being open to having the conversation that God was able to use in that particular situation. I had also asked you the question, how you felt after it. And as you said, you felt encouraged, because I'll never forget the very first time that I shared the gospel. I think I was a kid with my neighbor, right? Probably not so dissimilar from some of your early experiences.
Yeah.
I think I was probably 5 or 6 years old,
Yeah.
right? With the understanding of the gospel that I had at the time. And he gets down on his knees in front of his Muskoka chair that we're sitting on his front porch. And I lead him in a prayer to receive Christ.
Amazing. Yeah.
And I went home, Lucas, elated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So encouraged and elated. And I think it touches on that. I believe this is what we were made to do.
Yes. Yes.
Right? This is what we were made for. And I think that also touches on, which is a question I'd love to have you give some consideration to, which is that the distinction that sometimes people try to make is, well, it sounds like Lucas is like biggie evangelist. Maybe I'll talk to somebody about Jesus in my lifetime. But if we see it as, no, this is actually something that we were all made for.
Absolutely.
Now, where would you then make the distinction where Paul talks about the 5-fold leadership gifts, and one of them being evangelism?
Yes.
And so could you just kind of speak to that and debunk any myths that may exist in that conversation?
Sure. Yeah. This is an area that I'm really interested in, even like at a research level. And I need to spend a lot more time just even examining in the literature different perspectives that have been tossed around, APEST in particular, Ephesians 4, and how we understand offices, gifts, roles, etc. What I would say is this. There's sometimes this confusion when people say, we're all called to be evangelists. And I think I agree with the spirit of that statement when I often hear it used, which is to say, we're all called to participate in the work of witnessing to the reality of Christ's risen lordship and all of its implications for life. We're all called to participate in mediating Jesus's presence to a broken world. And we do that both in some sense individually as Christians in the context of our lives and the people around us, but also as we participate in the witnessing of the body of Christ and its expressions in local churches. So yes, we all are called to that for sure. But I would probably say, strictly speaking, no, I don't think we're all called to be evangelists in the same way that we're not all called to be pastors or prophets or apostles per Ephesians 4. So one of the things that I'm personally interested in and what drew me, in fact, to working with Message Canada is the desire to see, in some sense, the unique calling and role of the evangelist rediscovered in a Canadian context. For a long time in the Western theological tradition and church tradition, we've known what to do with pastors and teachers and sort of shepherds. We've had a place and a context for those expressions of leadership and ministry. But evangelists have always kind of been a bit of a fringe sort of, person or entity. And with the exception of maybe mass evangelists that we all know or love or respect or maybe have various misgivings with, the idea that every local church might have people who are actually called to serve as evangelists and who, by extension, Ephesians 4, are meant to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, particularly as it relates to the verbal proclamation of the gospel. I don't think we have a category for that. At least it's not something that I see in across most churches that I've participated in or have come alongside. So I guess in answer to your question, I would say we're not all called to be evangelists. But I think we are all called to both declare and demonstrate the good news of the gospel. And that's going to look different in each of our lives. And that's going to take forms that are different based on the other gifts that we have, based on our personalities, based on seasons and stages and contexts of life. But one thing I do hope to encourage and maybe be a part of instilling renewed confidence in for what we might say is the average, everyday Christian is that the verbal proclamation of the gospel is something that you can participate in and is something that I believe that God would call you to participate in. That doesn't need to take the form of street preaching or going door to door or handing out tracts on the street. For some people, arguably, maybe it still will. But all of us have been placed in particular contexts and are in relationships with particular people with whom we have been given opportunity, as Peter would say, to give reason for the hope that we have. I think the key dynamic there that Peter points to is that that's a hope that we're asked to explain. And so it seems like the New Testament expectation for the average church is not that every believer is running out and proclaiming the gospels from the streets, but that the totality of our way of life and being, not just individually, but in community, is raising questions from those around us and is demanding some kind of explanation. And, Leslie Newbegin would say that we ought to, I'm going to paraphrase him here, but we ought to live in such a way that the kingdom of God and the good news of the gospel is the only reasonable explanation for why we are the way that we are and who we are in the way that we live. And so I think in that respect, this is something that we're all called to participate in.
I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about Message Canada and how the organization is seeking to impact communities through the gospel.
For sure. Yeah. So Message Canada is a national hub of a global ministry, the Message Trust, which started in the UK in the late 1980s. And since that time, it's grown and spread to a number of different national hubs or countries throughout the world. And so in a Canadian context, we're relatively new. The ministry launched in around 2016. And so we're kind of in like the startup phase, I like to say, on Canadian soil. But at a high level, our sort of mission and vision is to serve and support local churches in both the proclamation and the demonstration of the gospel. And so historically, especially where it started in the 1980s, Message has had a particular focus on youth and what we might say are some of the hardest to reach marginalized communities, especially in like urban contexts and urban areas. However, I would say that, broadly speaking, the hope is just to equip the church to make Jesus known to everyone everywhere based on their own kind of context. In the Canadian focus of the ministry, there are sort of three key areas that we're seeking to develop. The first is community transformation. And so within this area, we have what we call Eden teams, like Garden of Eden teams. And if you're familiar with Move-In, there are some kind of similarities between Move-In as an urban ministry and Eden teams. But essentially, these are groups of people, Christians, who have intentionally chosen a sacrificial and incarnational approach to mission, whereby they have moved into marginalized areas, often of urban centers, in order to be an embodied witness within those communities. And so in 2018, we launched our first Eden team in the downtown east side of Vancouver. That was part of my visit to Vancouver last week, was just to meet some of the members of that team and hear more of the story of how God is working and what ministry has looked like there. So that's the kind of one area, community transformation, often with a focus on urban poverty or marginalized areas. The second is creative mission. And this is really going back to the roots of the Message in the UK in the 80s, which was a group of people who loved Jesus, wanted to make him known, and whose own kind of life and interests intersected with the sort of music, dance, and creative arts scene. And so a lot of their goal was to leverage those creative arts as opportunities to gather youth and create space for gospel proclamation. And so throughout the UK, creative mission teams have been involved in schools, camp programs, youth groups, with the purpose of using those tools and those avenues to make Christ known among youth. That's an area that is still very new in the Canadian context. We're still in the process of developing a team around that. Mm-hmm. The third area, which is the one that I would kind of give the most leadership to, is in training and equipping. And so, as I mentioned, one of the things that we want to do is be able to come alongside local congregations in Canada and actively equip and train people for the work of evangelism. And we would do this in a couple of areas. One is through small group training in what we call advanced groups. The other would be through just general resourcing. And then the third would be through events, regional training gatherings. So we have conferences, Lord willing, that will continue to pop up throughout the country over the coming years. Right now, we'll have one in Calgary at the end of February, but we're hoping to see a few more probably closer into Eastern Canada as well. And these would be opportunities either for church leaders, for evangelists proper in that sense, but also just for everyday Christians to come together and to be equipped, encouraged, empowered in areas related to evangelism. And so my role as the National Evangelism Lead primarily focuses on that third category.
Would you say, as you've both surveyed and begun the work, but then also through personal experience, something that Alpha, they had a study that came out last year, Reigniting Faith, I think it was titled, and they had done a survey to find out, what's the spiritual temperature in Canada. And what they were maybe shocked to find out was the interest levels across the country in spiritual conversation. So as you think about these equipping events, small group content, various things, I would imagine that you're feeling encouraged because it seems like there's an appetite. Or would you say is still to be determined as it relates to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I am like unabashedly a nerd when it comes to like all things research and research methodology and things like that in particular. So I've been thrilled to see some of the publications that have come out in the last few years, whether through Alpha or their partnerships with the Flourishing Congregations Institute. Barna has released a couple as well, and there are a few other Canadian research bodies that are trying to get just a grasp on like what is the existing spiritual climate in Canada, what is a receptivity to the faith like, what are trends in religious affiliation or non-religious affiliation, and then in particular, what's the church doing? What's the priority and the practice of evangelism look like in Canadian churches? So to be honest, I think I'm still trying to get my head around a lot of that data and in some sense dig into methodology, because I think it's easy for us to move quickly from studies to like an interpretive narrative about what those studies can conclusively say about any number of those questions. And I'm always kind of tentative because I think at a high level, we can take a particular stat and sort of construct a perception about an entire country's context in ways that might be somewhat premature. That said, I think in general, what we're seeing is that there is a steady growth in religious disaffiliation, and specifically in Christian disaffiliation in Canada. And so the proportion of Canadians that would check off on a census, I identify as Christian, has and continues to decline pretty rapidly. In fact, between 2001 and 2021, it had declined from, I think it was around 77% to about 55%, if I'm not mistaken. And then at the same time, the proportion of Canadians who said, I don't have any religious affiliation at all, it had doubled from about 16 to a little over 34. And so if you were to plot those two lines on a graph, what you'll find is that the trends remaining equal, we would suspect that as early as 2028, there will be more Canadians proportionally who say that they have no religious affiliation than there are who say that they are Christian. And if you chart that out further and you also add a line of any other faith affiliation, again, everything remaining equal in terms of trajectory, by 2041, the proportion of Canadians who identify as Christian will be not only far lower than those who identify as having no religious affiliation, but it will also be lower than those who identify as any other faith. And so in some sense, that can create a bit of a bleak picture, I guess, about the overall future for Christian faith in Canada. But I think there's other parts to the story as well. And to your point, some of the things that I think Alpha has pointed to in some of their recent publications is that notwithstanding, official disaffiliation from like Christian identification on a census, there does seem to be a spiritual appetite in our day. And I think that is true. And I think that there are in our communities pockets of people who really are receptive to spiritual conversation, to the gospel, to conversations around the relevance of faith for everyday life. And I think it behooves us to lean into those conversations and into those communities and figure out what credible and faithful, but also relevant gospel witness looks like in those contexts. I guess one of the areas that I'm personally interested in learning more about in particular is what some of the trends are around Gen Z and how Gen Z's approach to faith and spirituality has maybe changed in comparison, or perhaps is different in comparison to some former generations, but also how Gen Z Christians in particular, how their perceptions around evangelism have shifted too in comparison to previous demographics or generations as well.
How would you say, I'm sure some of this will be based on the research that you're going to do, but how is Message Canada innovating in the area of evangelism? And are there specific strategies or approaches in your mind that resonate particularly well with younger generations?
Yeah. One of the things that we're hoping to do, and we'll kind of have a soft launch to, God willing, in 2025, is convene what we're calling a national think tank for evangelism in Canada. And so the vision behind this is to bring together a mix of scholars from various disciplines that would be relevant to thinking about evangelism, as well as practitioners, people in ministry, whether from local churches or parachurch organizations that are actively doing the work of evangelism, and hopefully bring greater dialogue between those worlds in the hopes of, on the one hand, continuing to advance research in this space, but also identifying trends, best practices, stories of things that are working well, not with the intention to kind of copy paste, a silver bullet from one place to the next, but hopefully to learn in ways that can shape resources that would serve the witness of the Canadian church. So I'm very eager to see what will come about through the work of that think tank. God willing, it's a big part of my coming on board with the ministry is to hopefully get that off the ground. I think, to your question about younger generations and things that are maybe working well. One thing I'll say is that I think the general approach to faith conversation among Gen Z, whether we're talking about Christians or non-Christians, is in some sense different than previous generations. And in some sense, that difference has both challenges for Christian evangelism, but I think also opportunities. So one example of this, you referenced earlier the campus context, in your own past, thinking about anticipating coming into a conversation with someone who's reading Sam Harris and is sort of like a dogmatic atheist. And I think a conversation that I'm seeing unfold, not just among Christians, but just being recognized in general among people who are reflecting on the culture that we're living in, is that we are very much past the sort of new atheism movement, or at least the height of it, I would say. And so what was interesting about that time is that objections to the faith from that community of scholars, as represented by, Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, was characterized by a kind of dogmatic certainty and, in some sense, an appeal to like the objective and infallible truth of either science or a broader sort of atheistic worldview. And what I think is interesting is that I just don't think that flies anymore, especially for Gen Z. I think Gen Z is far more, their relationship with truth and the concept of truth is that it's probably relative at best, maybe even unknowable. And so whether you are the like absolutely certain dogmatic Christian or the absolutely certain dogmatic atheist, you're kind of already going to have like a non-starting place with the average person in Gen Z. The result then is that you have this sort of like far greater openness to what we might not know, to what could be. And I think this has been true not only in like conversations that I've observed with people, but just even like, significant moments, even on well-known podcasts and things of that nature, where people are open. I heard Joe Rogan recently when he was interviewing Wes Huff, just say like, I just, the idea that you think that you can say definitively what's going to happen after you die, just seems like arrogant. And it just seems like, how would you ever be able to say that? Absolutely. So I think for that reason, Gen Z values a more open, in some sense, a more like a dialogue approach, that I think strategies for evangelism with Gen Z that are willing to be relational, willing to embrace a more long-term approach to evangelism, that are willing to not simply focus on like a persuasive strategy, but are going to emphasize like some kind of mutuality and a desire to exchange ideas and to better understand one another. I think a lot of the research that's been done so far, Barna in particular, a couple of years ago, released some work on this, point to that approach being one that resonates more, both among Gen Z non-Christians as well as among Christians. Probably the challenge in that, of course, in some sense, that's like a reaction against a former way of approaching evangelism. But the challenge in that, of course, will be how do we maintain the unique call within the gospel to repentance and to embracing the lordship of Christ. There's one, actually, I was looking at it earlier this morning, so I'll read it to you here. There's one line I think that summarizes this well in Barna's report called Reviving Evangelism. They asked the question, is Gen Z posed to be the most adaptable and authentic generation of evangelists that the church has ever seen? Or will their approach to faith sharing without increasing gospel fluency and spiritual confidence veer from being impartial to being ineffective? And so I think that really is the question for our day. I think Gen Z is posed to have the potential for great evangelistic fruitfulness, and some of the baggage of the ways that evangelism has maybe been practiced in like the late 20th century in particular is something that they're aware of and very willing to shed. But the question will be, will the pendulum swing, maybe too far to the opposite extreme, where we have really well-spirited mutual conversations that aren't necessarily characterized by at some point calling people to repent and to trust in Christ. So it remains to be seen.
Well, Lucas, we'll have to continue this conversation in a number of months after you've done some more research and developed some trainings. But for now, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this podcast, and we'll be praying for you in your new work.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Cheers.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with Lucas that could be applied as this episode's action step. Lucas is very clearly a passionate and gifted evangelist, and my hope and prayer and belief is that his future will be filled with opportunities to train and equip Christians and evangelists across the country to then better equip and engage churches and ministries to engage in the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ in our country. And so I'd invite you to be praying with me about that as well. The thing that I want to focus as it relates to this episode's action step is when Lucas was talking about evangelism coming from a place of personal experience of Jesus' goodness and grace and mercy and love. And so the action step for this episode is simply to invite you to spend some time fanning into flame your love of Christ, experiencing his goodness. Maybe it's taking a passage from the Gospels and meditating on an experience that Jesus has with somebody there, doing some spiritual daydreaming, as I heard someone once say, and that's simply reading a text, having a good understanding of it in your mind, and then imagining yourself in that story, experiencing Christ, experiencing his love, and allowing Jesus to speak to you, to speak over your life and your experience. And so that's the action step. Spend some time with Jesus, fanning into flame, experiencing his goodness, which I believe then when you are experiencing his goodness, you will more readily talk about his goodness and grace to other people. As Lucas said, we talk about the things that we love. We talk about the things that we enjoy. We talk about the things that we believe are good. And so spend some time intentionally with Jesus. If you're not already, some additional time to fan into flame your love of Christ. Friends, I'm now going to leave you with a clip from my episode that will be released next week with my friend Matt Pamplin from Vision Ministries.
How to return back to being led by the Spirit. As I went into this new year, I was just thinking of Paul's language of keeping in step with the Spirit. So how do we trust again that Spirit's at work and join the Spirit in what it's doing, rather than just coming up with our next brilliant plan or strategy, but how do we trust what the Spirit's doing and to trust the Spirit is actually at work? You cannot live in fear. I feel like the fear narrative is pretty strong at the moment, but Jesus is at work here.